The morning they walked me out, I had a thermos of coffee in my left hand and a folder of Q4 vendor contracts in my right. I didn't even get to set them down. Security showed up at my office door at 9:14 a.m. I remember the time because I'd just glanced at my phone checking whether my daughter had texted back about Thanksgiving. She hadn't. That part didn't matter yet. But I remember the time. His name was Denny. I'd known him for 11 years. He used to bring his kids' school fundraiser catalogs around every October, and I'd buy the overpriced popcorn tins because that's what you do when you've worked somewhere long enough that people's kids feel like they're a little bit yours too. Denny looked at the floor when he knocked, wouldn't meet my eyes. That told me everything before a single word came out of his mouth. "Mr. Alderman," he said, "they need you in the main conference room." I set the thermos on my desk, left the contracts in my hand because some part of me still thought this was about the Henderson account. It wasn't about the Henderson account. The room was already full when I got there. That was the first thing I noticed. Not one or two people. Everyone. The entire regional leadership team. 3 faces I recognized from corporate, and sitting at the head of the table, in the chair that used to belong to a man I'd respected for 2 decades, was the new COO they'd flown in from the Atlanta acquisition. Her name was Serena Good, 37 years old. She'd been with the parent company for 4 years, and had never, as far as I could tell, spent a single day working in field operations. She wore the kind of confidence that comes from never having been wrong about anything yet. She didn't stand up when I walked in. "Miles," she said, "not Mr. Alderman. Miles." Like we were old friends, or like I was someone she was about to let borrow $5. "Have a seat." I'd been with Kellerman Distribution for 29 years. I started as a regional logistics coordinator when I was 26, fresh out of a state school in Ohio with a supply chain degree and a used Jeep Cherokee that burned oil. I worked my way up to Senior Director of Supplier Relations over the course of nearly 3 decades. Along the way, I'd built a network of 46 contracted vendors across 11 states, cold chain logistics, specialty chemical transport, temperature-sensitive pharmaceutical supply. Relationships that took years to develop. Some of them I built personally, sitting in diners with family business owners in places like Bowling Green and Terre Haute and Bozeman, shaking hands, learning their kids' names, showing up when it mattered. You don't build that kind of thing in 4 years. I sat down. Serena opened a folder. She had that practice gesture of someone who has delivered news like this before, or at least studied how other people do it. Smooth, controlled. A little theatrical. "We've completed the operational integration review," she said, "and we're making some changes to the leadership structure. The new model consolidates supplier relations under a centralized digital procurement platform. We're eliminating the senior director role and moving to a vendor management software system that will be administered out of Atlanta." The room was very quiet. I looked at the people I'd worked with for years. My former colleague Bert, who I'd trained personally, the regional VP Lana, who I'd helped navigate a supplier crisis in 2019 that would have cost the company a $6 million contract if we hadn't caught it in time. Nobody looked at me. They were all doing the thing people do when they know something is wrong but have decided it isn't their problem to fix. "You're eliminating my position," I said. "We're restructuring," Serena said, like the word made it softer. 29 years, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that. I'm not a man who raises his voice. My father worked in a steel plant in Youngstown for 31 years, and he used to say that the men who yelled the loudest in a room were usually the ones who had the least to stand on. I thought about him right then. I've managed over 40 supplier contracts, some of which are personally negotiated relationships that have been active for over a decade. You're aware that several of our specialty vendors operate on relationship-based agreements, not standard procurement contracts. Serena nodded, the way people nod when they're not really listening. We'll be reaching out to transition those accounts to the new platform. I nodded back, slowly, and then I stood up, because there was nothing left to say in that room. Serena added one more thing as I moved toward the door. She said it with a smile that I think was meant to be reassuring, but landed somewhere closer to dismissive. You'll have 2 weeks of severance for every year of service, and of course the transition team will be available to help with. I didn't hear the rest. Not because I was angry. I was past angry. I was somewhere else entirely, in the particular cold clarity that settles in when something you've given 3 decades of your life to decides, without ceremony, that it's done with you. Denny was waiting in the hallway. He handed me a box, pre-packed, which meant they'd already been in my office. Already decided. The folder of Q4 contracts I'd been carrying was still in my hand. "I'm sorry, Miles," he said quietly. "It's okay, Denny," I said, and I meant it. None of this was his. I walked out through the lobby, past the reception desk where a woman named Carla had greeted me every morning for 16 years. She was on the phone and gave me a small wave, didn't know yet, through the main doors and into the parking lot where the October air hit me, sharp and clean, carrying the smell of cut grass from somewhere across the road and the faint diesel exhaust from the loading dock around back. I sat in my truck for a long time. My daughter, Jess, was 24, in her second year of a physician assistant program down in Nashville. I'd been squirreling away money for her program costs since she was accepted, not tuition exactly, more the living expenses, the clinical rotations, the equipment costs that nobody mentions when your kid gets into a good program. Her mother and I had been divorced for 8 years, civil about it, the way 2 people can be when they've both moved on, and the most important thing between them is a kid they both do anything for. I told Jess I'd cover what I could. That felt like the most important thing I had going. I drove home. The house was quiet. It's a 3-bedroom ranch on the east side of Columbus that I bought in 2004 when the market was soft and the neighborhood was starting to turn. I'd refinished the floors myself, painted the garage, replaced the water heater twice. It was mine in the way that a house becomes yours after enough years of fixing things in it at midnight. I made a sandwich I didn't eat and sat at the kitchen table with the folder of contracts still in front of me. I thought about what Serena had said about transitioning the specialty vendors to the new platform, about digital procurement software reaching out to Earl Dubois, who ran a family-owned refrigerated transport company out of Rockford, Illinois, and who had told me once, over coffee at a Flying J off I-90, that he'd only stayed with Kellerman because he trusted me to call him before a problem became a problem, about the people at Hartwell Chemical Logistics in Louisville, where I'd spent 2 days in 2017 negotiating a rate restructure that saved Kellerman $800,000 annually and saved Hartwell from having to lay off their night shift. I'd been to their company Christmas party twice. I was not a vendor management software platform. I was a person. And in 29 years, I had built something that worked precisely because it was personal. The question that sat with me, quietly, in that kitchen was whether anyone at Kellerman had actually thought through what they were replacing. The answer came faster than I expected. 11 days after I walked out of that building, my phone rang at 7:40 in the morning. It was a number I recognized, Kellerman's main corporate line in Atlanta. I let it go to voicemail. They called back 20 minutes later. Different number this time. Direct line. I let that one go too. The third call was from my former colleague Bert, and I answered that one because Bert had always been decent to me and I didn't hold what happened in that conference room against him. "Miles," he said, "I'm not supposed to be calling you." He sounded like a man who hadn't slept well. "Things are. It's a situation over here." "Tell me," I said. What Bert told me took about 4 minutes. Apparently, the new digital procurement system had sent out automated renewal notices to all 46 supplier accounts simultaneously, generated by a software integration that nobody had tested properly. 14 vendors had received contracts with incorrect rate structures. 3 of them, including Earl Dubois's company and a cold chain pharmaceutical carrier out of Indianapolis called Ashwood Medical Transport, had responded by freezing shipments pending clarification. And here was the thing nobody at the Atlanta office had understood. Ashford Medical Transport handled the cold chain supply for a regional hospital network contract that Kellerman had spent 18 months securing. The contract was worth $14.2 million annually. It had a performance clause. If Ashford's shipments were delayed more than 72 hours without documented cause, the hospital network had the right to trigger a penalty review. They were now at hour 61. I listened to all of this without saying anything. The thing is, Bert said carefully, Earl won't talk to anyone from Atlanta. He keeps asking for you. And the contact at Ashford. Terrence, I called him this morning and he said, and I'm quoting, I don't know who these people are. I work with Miles. I was quiet for a moment. Bert, I said, I don't work there anymore. I know, he said. Miles. I know that. There was a long pause. I'm sorry, he said, for what happened in that room. I should have said something. Yeah, I said. You should have. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for the better part of an hour. I thought about the $14.2 million contract and the 72-hour clause, and the fact that my name was still in Earl Dubois's phone under the heading Miles Kellerman, call first. I thought about Terrence at Ashford Medical, who had driven 2 hours to Columbus for a dinner I'd organized in 2021 when we renegotiated their terms, and who had shaken my hand at the end of the night and said something I'd never forgotten. You're the only logistics director I've ever dealt with who acted like a partner instead of a vendor. I thought about Jess, down in Nashville, and the $11,000 she needed for her third-year clinical rotation equipment and housing. Then I called a lawyer. My brother-in-law's cousin had done employment law for 20 years in Cincinnati. He was a precise, unhurried man named Gareth, who had the quality of making complicated things feel manageable. I explained the situation. The termination, the severance offer, the circumstance. He asked me several questions. He told me several things. The most important thing he told me was that there was a version of this where I had more options than I currently understood. The second call I made was to a consulting firm contact I'd kept in my network since a conference in Denver in 2016. A woman named Petra who specialized in supply chain transition advisory. She'd worked with me briefly on a third-party audit for Kellerman back when the current parent company was still just a name in an industry newsletter. She picked up on the second ring. I heard what happened, she said, which tells me the industry was smaller than Kellerman's new COO seemed to understand. I'm thinking about next steps, I said. I may have something, she said. Give me until Thursday. On Thursday, Petra called back. A regional distribution holding company out of Indianapolis, a firm called Carver Logistics Group, was looking to expand their supplier network in the Midwest corridor. They'd been trying to break into the pharmaceutical cold chain space for 2 years, but hadn't been able to secure the right vendor relationships. She didn't have to explain what that meant. I had those relationships. What happened next took about 3 weeks to arrange, but the shape of it was simple. Carver brought me on as a senior consultant at a day rate that came out to roughly twice my former annual salary on an annualized basis, with a conversion clause to a staff director role at the 6-month mark if both parties wanted to continue. I would be working primarily from home with quarterly travel to Indianapolis and site visits as needed. The first call I made in my new capacity was to Earl Dubois. He answered on the first ring, which is what Earl always did. Miles, he said, thought you might call eventually. Earl, I said, how are Karen and the kids? Karen's good. Oldest just made varsity basketball. Can you believe that kid's 6'2"? I believe it. Kid's 6'2". I believe it, I said. Earl, I've got something to talk to you about. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. At the end of it, Earl had agreed to a preliminary partnership discussion with Carver Logistics Group, contingent on a meeting with their VP of Operations, and a rate structure he found reasonable. It wasn't a signed contract, but it was the beginning of one. I called Terrence at Ashford Medical the next morning. That call lasted 25 minutes. Terence had already been approached by 2 other logistics firms in the previous 2 weeks. Apparently, word had gotten around that the relationship with Kellerman was unstable. He told me he'd been waiting to see what I landed before making any decisions. "Where you going, Miles?" he asked. "Indianapolis Group," I said. "Growing fast. Good people. They want to do this right. Send me the information," he said. Within 45 days of the morning Denny handed me that box in the hallway. 3 of Kellerman's most critical specialty vendor relationships were in active discussions with Carver Logistics Group. I never called Kellerman back. Not once. What I heard through Bert, who remained a decent source of information even after everything, was that the hospital network penalty review had been triggered. The final outcome of that I can't say with certainty, but Bert told me in January that Kellerman's Q4 numbers in the Midwest Division had come in well below projection, and that Serena had spent most of December in Atlanta in back-to-back meetings with the parent company's executive team. What I do know is what happened on a Tuesday evening in late November. Jess called me from Nashville at around 7. I was in the kitchen working through a vendor assessment doc on my laptop, a bowl of leftover chili going cold beside me. She said she'd gotten the details finalized on her 3rd-year rotation and that the equipment costs had come in a little under what we'd budgeted. "Does that help?" she asked. "It does," I said. There was a pause. "Dad," she said, "are you doing okay? Like, actually okay? You've been kind of, I don't know, quieter than usual." I looked around my kitchen, the house that I'd fixed things in at midnight for 20 years, the chili going cold, the laptop open to a vendor assessment for a company that wanted to grow in exactly the direction I knew how to take it. "Yeah, Jess," I said. "I think I'm actually okay." She wasn't satisfied with that. She never has been, which is one of the things about her that I've always admired. She pushed a little, the way she does, and I told her some of it. Not everything, not the hard months, but the shape of what had happened and what came after. The way things sometimes work out sideways when you don't expect them to. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So they fired you and then the whole thing fell apart." "Part of it," I said. She paused. "That's kind of poetic, Dad." "Your grandfather would have called it something less poetic," I said. "He would have called it the math working out." She laughed. I hadn't heard her laugh like that in a few weeks, and it settled something in me that had been loose for a while. I signed the staff director offer with Carver in late January. The day rate became a salary with full benefits and a relocation allowance I didn't need since I was staying in Columbus. My official title was Vice President of Supplier Strategy, Midwest Region. I was 53 years old. It was the first vice president title I'd ever held. I kept the same thermos I'd carried out of Kellerman that morning. It sits on my desk now, next to a photo of Jess at her white coat ceremony from the spring. She's squinting a little because the sun was coming in sideways, and she's laughing at something I said right before the shutter clicked, and that expression on her face is just about the best thing I've ever done. The math works out. Not always clean, not always fast, but it works out. There's a moment in that kitchen I keep coming back to. The chili going cold, the laptop open, the phone sitting quiet on the table. 11 days after I walked out of a building I'd given nearly 3 decades to. The math started working itself out. Not because I'd planned it that way, not because I'd done anything clever or strategic in that conference room when Serena was telling me about digital procurement platforms. I just stood up and left. That was all. But here's what I've come to understand about that. The leaving was only possible because of everything that came before it. 29 years of showing up early, of driving to diners in Terre Haute and Bowling Green, of learning the names of people's kids and remembering them the next year. That isn't sentimentality. That's integrity. The kind that accumulates quietly and doesn't announce itself until the moment it's tested. When Earl Dubois picked up my call on the first ring, that was 29 years of integrity picking up the phone. You can't automate that. You can't migrate it to a platform in Atlanta. I think about what my father used to say about the men at the plant in Youngstown, the ones who lasted, the ones who mattered. He said they weren't necessarily the smartest guys in the room. They were the ones who understood that how you do a thing is inseparable from what you're actually doing. The man who handles a vendor relationship like a transaction will always lose eventually to the man who handles it like a responsibility. That's not a philosophy. That's just cause and effect, played out over time. What I had, and what Kellerman accidentally threw away, was knowledge built from years of paying close attention, knowing which accounts had soft clauses, knowing that Terence at Ashford needed a phone call, not an automated renewal notice, knowing that Earl operated on trust and that trust, once extended, required someone on the other end worth extending it to. That's the kind of understanding you can't shortcut. It isn't born in a spreadsheet. It's built the way Jess built her clinical skills, hour by hour, case by case, in the unglamorous middle of things, when nobody is watching and the only reason to do it right is because doing it right is the point. And that's the part I want to hold on to, more than the VP title or the day rate or any of it. The part where Jess called from Nashville and asked if I was actually okay, and I looked around that kitchen and realized I was, because the thing that had survived all of it, the box in the hallway, the parking lot, the quiet weeks at home, was still intact. The work I'd done was real. The relationships I'd built were real. Those didn't go into the box Denny handed me. Whatever comes at you, whatever gets restructured or eliminated or handed to a software platform in another city, the things you've genuinely built, the way you've genuinely treated people, those don't terminate with your badge access. They go wherever you go. The math works out, not always on your timeline, but it works out.